Good evening to you. I know how busy you'll be at COP28, so thank you for taking a few minutes today. We asked you here to talk about your area of expertise and a topic at COP, agriculture. As the former VP of Corporate Strategy and Development at Cargill for the Asia Pacific region, you invested across the full food and agriculture value chain. Now, as the founder of Nutrire Capital, a platform that focuses on food and agriculture, we would like to hear your unique perspective on this asset class and how one can make a positive impact on society and climate while making impressive returns. So the first question we have is a pretty basic one. Why is the food and ag space important?
Jen, thank you, and good evening to you. Actually, good morning to you, good evening from where I am. And thank you for having me on. I think the question that you started off with is probably the most basic, but yet the most critical question that people ask. And if I take a step back, right, and try and put it into perspective, food is probably the only thing that truly has shaped our planet, or in other words, reshaped our planet. Whole economies and national security depends on food today. If I think about some facts and figures, the system feeds 8 billion people, 40% of the world's population. It employs 40% of the world's population. And just think about this, 65% of the low-income working class adults are employed in this sector, 65%. So this sector is just unique in the impact that it has on a global level, not just on economies, on people, but on the planet itself. On the flip side, it accounts for most of our water usage, high percentage of our land use, and provides a bulk of the greenhouse gas emissions. So there's a positive and there's a negative that we'll discuss a little more in detail as we go further into our conversation. If I were to take a step back, the last 50 years have been critical for food and ag. What we saw was the Green Revolution, which was food production effectively doubled over the last 50 years, given innovations in crop protection, chemical fertilizers, mechanization, and obviously improved feed. And what was critical was all this was done while keeping land use relatively in the same zip code, which was critical because some of the downside of food and ag has been around deforestation, biodiversity loss, and increased emissions, right? But the last 50 years of Green Revolution have been critical to help feed the world while not encroaching too much on land use. And that's critical for as we think about the next 50 years. So we talked about the last 50 years, we talked about why it's important. If I think about the next 50 years, the challenge is going to be multidimensional. And I think people need to get their head around this. We're going to have 10 billion people by 2050. Not only will they require the same amount of calories that they're having today, they will require higher value-add calories. Urbanization is going to increase. More people are going to go into the urban middle class. And they're not just going to want grains, they're going to want protein. So people's diets are going to change. Their focus on health is going to change. And to some extent, people over the next 30 odd years are going to focus more on climate. We've seen the trend yet, but it hasn't really taken full force. I think the second thing is, just to give you a little bit of, again, context, the new additions of in population and changing taste will mean that the global food demand will increase by about 60% by 2050. And that all has to be met. And it's let me tell you, it's not going to be easy, right? So we have growing populations, we have changing demand. We then have the interesting perspective of the nexus between food and health. Health has always been about cure. Over the last 15, 20 years, it's become more and more about prevention. Prevention has to do with food. And so you're not just feeding people, you're trying to get them to eat better, reduce diabetes, reduce cancer, reduce heart diseases. Yeah. That's going to be another pull from the food and ag space. I think The last thing, which I want to call out, as the transition from fossil fuel goes, we're moving towards more sustainable fuel, which means there's a direct demand for grain, and there's a pull between food or fuel. And so you're trying to feed the world. There's a huge amount of focus on sustainable fuel, having this pull, which is demand in both sides. So the demand over the next 30 to 40 years is going to be met very differently from the last 50 years. And if I were to kind of sum this up, access to nutritious food is going to be the defining issue of the 21st century, right? I think that just kind of sums it up.
Thank you for that. What do you tell investors who are unsure, and how do you explain the need and the opportunity specifically in Asia Pacific, where you have your expertise?
So I'll break this answer into a few different parts. Lots of white space exists for an industry that's approximately valued at $10 trillion. There's very limited institutional capital available in the space. The figure itself, 10 trillion, is immense, and the fact that there's limited capital is kind of mind-boggling to me even to this day. But if you look at the sector, right, from pre-farm all the way to fork, it's so many different sectors within the value chain, each with their own return profile, margin profile, different in how they react to different cycles, that you have the ability to play a huge array of different sectors with different returns to maximize the potential across the value chain. That is relatively unique. You can play infrastructure through silos and terminals. You can play protein, you can play animal feed, you can invest in superfoods, you can invest more downstream in brands and focus on health and wellness. You can focus on technology through agri-tech and food tech. So the array of investable opportunity and investable space is, in my mind, unparalleled. So that's critical. Huge market, $10 trillion, lots of white space and lots of different opportunities. I think the other interesting thing, and I'm just going to take a slightly deeper dive, the industry itself is still highly fragmented, mostly privately owned and not well covered from an institutional perspective, right? Whether it's equity or debt, still a lot of people who don't have access to that capital from the industry. You see some private equity players in that, but these are more generalist funds where you see them play closer to the consumer towards the brand side. There are very few specialist funds that play upstream or the whole value chain. So that space is still, despite the increasing importance of the sector, still quite virgin. I think what we started seeing over the last 5-7 years is some of the impact funds have started focusing on this sector. But that is still, again, at a newer and more relatively new stage. The last couple of things, there's institutional capital that's gone into land, but that's primarily as an inflation hedge and for value appreciation. So you've got all these different pockets, but really not a lot of institutional capital that covers the whole space. I think the two other important points we're seeing is one of food security. After COVID, people suddenly woke up and said, when our populations needed food and grain, we couldn't get access to it. And whether that was India and Vietnam shutting off rice exports for a bit, or obviously the aftermath of Russia and Ukraine, it had a real impact. And that impact is leading countries to focus on what they can do to make sure that that doesn't happen to their population. A lot of that is focused on sovereign wealth funds and where they're putting their investments and what agreements they have in place to make sure that they are not caught in the same way that they were caught in COVID. That's important. I think the last thing, and we touched upon this, is around technology. We talked about it from a perspective of sustainability, but the other thing from an investable perspective is food tech and agri-tech valuations over the last 5 years had gone sky high. The last 12 to 18 months, you've kind of seen them taper off and come down to more manageable levels. So that's the last part that has become attractive again. So in summarize, large space, still relatively uncovered from an institutional perspective, lots of different spaces to invest in, and the innovation and technology opportunities only going further up the S-curve. So this is just a unique investing opportunity where there are a lot of returns to be had if people dig deep and put their money to work in a thoughtful manner.
And what makes APAC particularly interesting?
So I think globally it is super interesting.
Of course, yeah.
APAC specifically has been more underinvested than the rest of the globe. Maybe APAC and Africa are aligned. So APAC, and I read this figure, over the next 10 years will need about $800 billion of investment just to keep people eating the same calorie levels that they are today. And the lack of investment is driven by the fact that, again, APAC more than any other region is driven by smallholder farms who don't have the know-how or the capital to invest. And that investment is critical and needed. A lot of this is family-owned who need the help to come up the S-curve and come to the levels that Europe and US are. And I think you'll see that over the next 15 to 20 years, but institutional capital has a huge part to play in that.
Thank you. Appreciate that nuance there. So again, thank you, Mumtaz. I appreciate your time. So nice to see you again. And I always love our discussions around this particular topic. I look forward to hearing your thoughts at the conclusion of the conference, and hopefully there are some positive things that come out of it this year.
And look, I'm sure there are. I looked at the agenda. It is super interesting. There are 2 to 3 days focused on water, land, and ag. So I think it's going to be an outstanding session. Thank you again.
Hope so. Thank you so much. Take care and safe travels.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.